This lesson is called Define the Narrative, and it's one that many people have said has made a tremendous impact on them. When we're in a relationship, we often start to look at our spouse in certain ways. We define them as being certain topics, like they're selfish or they're abusive or other things. And sometimes we define them as good things. They're kind, they're generous, and they're giving and sweet and nice, etc. One of the big dangers when trying to repair relationships is that narrative that we have. And what I want to bring out 2 points based on 2 studies to help you understand what this narrative is, because many people's gut reaction, especially when I work with people one-on-one, is to say, that's not a narrative, that's just a reality. I'm describing what I'm constantly seeing. And that's something that I think that we could look at again, and it might be very beneficial. So let's talk about this. One study was very fascinating. It basically took about 100 college students and put them in a room with a certain person, a Confederate that was working for the study, and took another 100 and put them in the room with the same people. And basically the interactions started off the same, and the students had to report whether they saw the person as friendly or nasty. The only difference between the 100 students is that the first 100 students were told that, hey, you're going to be put in a room, and this guy is an extremely nasty and vicious person, so be careful when you interact with him. And the second half had been predisposed to believe that this person is very nice, kind, and generous and gentle, and it's going to be a pleasure to work with this person and to talk with this person. And what was interesting is that despite the neutrality of the conversations that took place, about 75% of the first students who were predisposed to believe that this man was nasty reported that, in fact, yeah, they saw how cold he was and how nasty he was. And 75% of the other students who had been predisposed to believe that he was a happy and pleasant person, they also reported that they really saw evidence of that and experienced that in their interaction, although most of the conversations were basically neutral. So what that shows us very clearly is that often we get stuck in a narrative of looking at someone in a certain way. Okay. Another study that was done was also very interesting, was basically just a lineup of people. And in this lineup, they were told that before they looked at the lineup of people, they were told that these were all people who were innocent, but yet they were being accused of a crime they didn't do. And again, most of the participants that looked at them actually saw, hey, these are innocent people, and they, I could tell that they're innocent and they look innocent. When in fact all of them had very serious criminal records. So again, that disposition of just being told that, hey, these are people that are set up, kind of makes us look at them as the victim, and helps us find compassion for them, and actually work to make people have a more positive attitude towards them. And in another study, the exact opposite was done, where people that were in fact innocent were put in this lineup, and the students were told beforehand that these are very, very guilty and disgusting and deplorable people to society, and were asked to rate them. And once again, they gave very negative things and said, yeah, I could tell how sly that person is and how negative. And again, obviously a lot of these things were exaggerated. But the bottom line is that when we have a predisposition to look at someone in a certain way, it's very hard to break away from that. And sometimes we end up even feeding into it. And what I'm trying to help you do is a couple of steps. But the first one, and this is just so important, to either type it out or write it down. And of course, like I always say, it has to be in a place that is safe, that's not going to be seen by other people, because then you're not going to be comfortable writing things. And if you say to me, well, I don't really care, my spouse knows what I think about them, or they could read it. Well, actually, I can respect that, but I advise against it, because I think that it's important for you to be able to have a safe place. And I also think that while you're trying to repair things in this relationship, it's better not to expose them to things for no reason. If you need to have a conversation with them, those are other lessons that we've talked about and will talk about. But I always think it's good for you to have something safe for you to be able to write and express and not trigger the situation and make it worse. So the first thing I want you to do is write down what is your disposition towards your spouse, and literally 3 to 5 sentences of, this is how I see my spouse. And that narrative is actually something that you'll probably find to be a common narrative. And in couples that have worked through a lot of their things and worked to be close, the narrative is usually very, very positive. And in couples that have not yet worked things out or are going spiraling out of control, the narrative is usually quite negative. And John Gottman points out a very interesting thing. In his research, he also found that couples that were in a bad place had a tendency to even take past memories that might have been even good, like a nice vacation, but yet in their mind to actually change it around and see it as a lot worse than what it was, or see an incident there as a lot more severe than what it actually was. Once again, this shows us very clearly that when we get into a negative narrative, we start self-fulfilling it as well. Okay, so that being said, I want you to define what the narrative is, those 3 to 5 sentences. And the next step that I want you to do is I want you to just start noticing how you play into this narrative and how you expect it, and how even some of the neutral things that your spouse does actually triggers you, and you take them just in light of the narrative that you kind of expect. And I want you to start breaking away from that and changing that. Okay. Now, I know at this point you might say, well, Joe, like, no, I'm not causing anything. I'm not doing this. I'm not making my spouse mistreat me. I know that. I understand that. That's very true. You're probably not. What I'm trying to do is 2 things. One of them is that I'm trying to change the neutral things and help them have more of a positive spin instead of a negative spin. Because when when you believe that you're being treated negatively, then things start to spiral on your end. You get defensive, and you do the things that you do to defend yourself, which is very reasonable. Anyone would. I would do the same thing. Anyone would do that. So I want to try to help get rid of the neutral things. And the second thing is very interesting, and that is that I want to make sure that you're not playing into the problem by giving the impression to your spouse that they're hopeless, beyond repair, and that they're always only doing negative things. Because when you get into that mode, then sometimes your spouse, who is, correctly, according to you and according to them even, mistreating you, but they say, well, there's nothing I could do. I mean, anything I ever do is wrong and negative. And so I want to help you get out of that mindset. And this is a very, very helpful starting point. So just define the narrative. Try to figure out, how do I know when things are really neutral and when I'm playing into the narrative. And most importantly, I want you to rewrite the narrative. Rewrite the narrative of, if this relationship could be improved over the next 1 to 3 months, what would it look like? How would this narrative change? And I want you to actively do things to be able to make that happen. And one of the big ways that I like to do that is, first of all, to change your mindset into looking at your spouse as a generous, caring person, because there obviously is some generosity and some caring in there that's there. We're just trying to help express the other parts of it and trying to really connect with that and feel safe. One of the things I like to do is give the opportunity for positive things. We never want to test our spouses. So if the narrative is, my spouse always forgets about me and puts me last, well, get in the habit of actually proactively talking to your spouse and asking them, just to review, we talked about last week that I had a meeting and that I'm going to be home late. Just want to go over my schedule with you. Is now a good time? And that could be a very helpful thing to give them that opportunity. And instead of testing your spouse, like, well, let's see if my spouse kisses me when he or she gets home from work, or he or she walks in, ask for what you want. Just be open, because sometimes that narrative, again, has neutral parts, or sometimes it has negative parts that we're actually encouraging. And what I want you to learn how to do is to change that narrative, because when we could slowly chip away and make changes on that narrative, it makes profound differences and changes in your life. Give it a try, and you will see how much different your life could be.